Hi, this is Eric I. I'd like to give you some background on William Shakespeare. First question, why read Shakespeare? I often tell students that Shakespeare would sort of be his generation's equivalent to Steven Spielberg or George Lucas, somebody like that. He was a master of entertainment, real power in his language. His characters are complex, psychologically complex. We can relate to them nowadays. We see ourselves in them. But above all, Shakespeare was an entertainer. He wasn't writing just for the educated elite. He's writing for the masses. He wants the working class guy, the middle class person, the upper class people. He wants all those folks to be able to come to his plays and enjoy themselves, but probably most importantly for Shakespeare, who was a good businessman, a very savvy businessman, he wanted them to come and spend money. So it's one of the first questions students often ask is like, why are we reading this guy? He hasn't written anything in 400 years. What's the appeal? And I think that's part of it is again that he's writing for the masses, and he's to us, there's little problems with the language at first, but these stories, we see the relevancy. We connect to it. These are things, these themes and these motifs and these ideas. They're timeless. Shakespeare basically hasn't written anything. He's probably wrote up into about 1613, and he passed away in 1616. I'll talk more about that here in a few. But he still influences writers. Here's just a couple. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I got Infinite Jest, Christmas Carol, Crime and Punishment, Ulysses, Les Mis. You might recognize these titles or you recognize these authors. And the point is not to have an all-inclusive list, um, but just to kind of give you a sense of sort of Shakespeare's influence across cultures. David Foster Wallace, American writer. Charles Dickens, English. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russian. Victor Hugo, French. James Joyce, Irish. So he's somebody who is transcended time as well as place. Impressive body of work Shakespeare has, depending upon who you talk to. 37 or 39 plays. Pretty much what we can figure out is he has written or he wrote 37 plays on his own, and he helped a couple buddies out with two other plays. So you often see 39 cited. He also wrote 154 sonnets and a whole bunch of other plays. So maybe you've heard of Hamlet, maybe you've heard of Macbeth, Henry IV. Julius Caesar, Tempest. Maybe you've read some of these. Othello's out there. Taming of the Shrew. Much Ado About Nothing. Midsummer Night's Dream. Um, Plays that even if you're not sitting in English class, plays that you recognize, stories that you recognize. So again, just part and parcel of that influence that Shakespeare has had on especially Western culture, if not world culture. One thing I want to mention before I talk about Shakespeare's impact on our language is it's interesting to think about that Shakespeare's plays weren't written down really during his lifetime. They were written down by some friends after he had died in 1623, a full 7 years after he had passed, and they wanted to grab his words for posterity's sake. And it seems odd to us, and it probably is one of the things that sort of fuels that, was Shakespeare a real guy? And those sorts of debates. But keep in mind, their culture obviously was very different than ours. Just as we're kind of transitioning from sort of a print book culture to an electronic culture, they were transitioning from an oral culture to a book one. So they didn't have a lot of books, and a lot of things didn't get put down in print. The other reason his plays wouldn't have been written down is they didn't have copyright laws. So Shakespeare and other playwrights had to guard their work jealously. They wanted to make sure that people didn't steal them. And because if your play got out there, then somebody else could perform it at their theater. They could undercut you. So these are just some of the reasons why the plays wouldn't have been written down. But speaking about Shakespeare's influence on language, look at this list here. Grovel, rant, zany, jaded, obscene, besmirch. You could probably add, depending upon your source, you could probably add two, three, maybe even 400 words to this list. These are words that Shakespeare coined. These are words that didn't exist until he came along. That's amazing to think about. And maybe a word like besmirch you don't use too often, but I'm sure you've used or heard the word rant or called somebody or something zany. Or you heard maybe your Aunt Gertrude say, well, that's obscene. Well, these words weren't around. Again, these were coined by Shakespeare. And he would see gaps in language and would decide to fill that gap by coining his own term. Pretty amazing to think about. So even if you haven't read his plays or very many of his plays, you still have been influenced by him. The last thing I'd mention before we get into some biographical information about Shakespeare is that a lot of times students when they first come across Shakespeare, they think, they'll call him Old English or Middle English. Just on a technicality, just so you know, he's actually considered modern English, early modern, of course, but it's still considered the same language that you and I speak. He's not Middle English, he's not Old English, which truly are different languages. So just something to keep in mind. So some biographical information. This is William's birthplace. This is his house. I still have it. Pretty amazing. From Stratford upon Avon. And you can still go there and they'll let you walk around and see, this is William's bedroom and all this kind of stuff. Pretty interesting. He was born April 23rd, 1564. Again, his hometown, Stratford upon Avon. It's probably a couple hours by car or bus outside of London. Back in his day, it would have taken probably a couple days by horse. And at the minimum, you'd have to stay overnight someplace. This is where Shakespeare spent most of his years until he went to London as a young man. He would have attended the local Latin grammar school. And unfortunately, Shakespeare was only able to attend school until about the age of 12. His father went bankrupt and needed William's help at home in the family business. They were glove makers, which is kind of interesting to think about. Little side note here, Shakespeare's father, as far as we can tell, was illiterate, did not read nor write. Amazing to think about that. But Shakespeare's school, this Latin grammar school that I mentioned, he only went till he was about 12, as I said. But they would attend school about 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they would do fun things like double translation. So in the morning, they would take a text, translate it from English into Greek. And in the afternoon, they would maybe translate it from Greek into Latin and then Latin back into English. Yes, lots of fun. So that was the kind of education he had. Very long days, very rigorous, but also sort of, I think, would help inform like his control and command of the language. So he's helping dad with the business after school up until about 18. He gets married. He marries Anne Hathaway. Not that Anne Hathaway, but a different one. She was 8 years older than he was. And they got married, had 3 kids. I'll kind of skip over his bulk of his life because I'll talk about his works mostly, but I'll tell you that Shakespeare is either died or was buried on his birthday, April 23rd, in 1616. So he made it to about 52 years of age. Not too bad for back then. And he did well for himself. The fact that we're still studying his plays 400 years later tells us that he did pretty well for himself. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where his plays would have been performed. I started off at a place called the Theater in 1576. Well, the theater opened in 1576. He wouldn't have joined them until the early 1590s. This is kind of complicated and kind of hard for us to understand, but folks in London were sort of not big fans of the theater, even though they all went to them. And what I mean by that, they were okay with going to the theater, but they didn't want it in their backyard because it attracted sort of a lot of ne'er-do-wells, they thought, and a lot of partiers and all this kind of stuff. So I guess Shakespeare and some of his buddies got a little frustrated with this. So one night in 1598, they snuck across the River Thames and took down the theater, got the timber, and snuck it across and built their own theater. And they called it the Globe. And that was 1598, which means that the majority of Shakespeare's plays would have been performed at the Globe. So these images here, if you start at the top right there, that's from the River Thames itself, kind of gives you a sense of this isn't a theater sort of off by itself. It was right in the heart of everything. And as you get a little closer, coming clockwise, you kind of get a sense of its construction and its thatch roof. It's not a huge building. I mean, it could hold 3,000 people, but it's not a stadium or anything like that. And it was pretty tight. I've been there, and the stairways and the seats and everything are pretty tight. They were a lot smaller as a whole back then than we are now. And the bottom picture there is obviously an inside view, and you can kind of see the stage as it juts out. And if you look closely, you can see the balcony there at the back of the stage. You can kind of see a couple doorways. That's about it. You can see the pillars coming down there at the front of the stage. That's their set design. You know, that was really it. They would spend money, but not on sets. It was mostly on costumes. And if you happen to be a working class guy and didn't have much money, for half a penny, you could stand down there where that woman in the orange is, and you could watch the play for half a penny. And they would call you a groundling. How about that? A groundling. And then the people who had a lot of money might pay a lot more and be able to sit on the stage during the performance because it was about being seen as much as seeing. And there, the top left is sort of a cutaway of the globe to kind of give you a sense of what it looks like. Again, it's an open air facility, so on heavy rain days, they couldn't have the play. Kind of interesting. So some of the guys who worked with and for Shakespeare, the two troops that Shakespeare primarily belonged to would have been the Lord Chamberlain's men and the King's men. Lord Chamberlain's men would have been mostly under Queen Elizabeth, and Shakespeare would often cast himself as a leader or a king of the sort. So not only is he writing the plays, he's acting in them, which is pretty cool. The best known actor of Shakespeare's day and who worked for Shakespeare was Richard Burbage. And I don't know if that's the best photo we can find or best image of Richard Burbage, but that's what we have. The cool thing I think about Burbage would have been that he could memorize 800 lines in a day, if need be, because they would perform a play on Monday, perform a different play on Tuesday, different play on Wednesday. So it wasn't sort of like how we run theater nowadays. So that's kind of interesting. And he would have maybe not played Romeo, for example, but maybe would have played Mercutio or somebody like that. He would have taken the best, most interesting roles. Will Kemp was, whereas Richard Burbage is the best known sort of serious actor, Will Kemp was the best known comic actor. So in Romeo and Juliet, for example, he would have probably played the nurse. In Henry IV, that you saw the image of earlier, he would have played Falstaff. So very popular, put into place for comic relief. Audiences would have loved him. The King's Men would have been Shakespeare's troupe renamed after King James I became King of England. And you wanted to make sure that you got on the right side of the monarchy. So in 1603, they became the King's Men. Made sense. Again, King James. And you might recognize King James I because when folks pick up a Bible, it often says the King James translation or the King James version. It's coming from when he was King of England. He was interested in plays, but he had a short attention span. And so it's probably not an accident that Shakespeare's shortest play is Macbeth, which is set in Scotland. James I, I'll give you one guess what his home country was before he became King of England. Yes, you got it, Scotland. So the monarchy could exert some control on the theaters here. So let's look at Shakespeare's final words. And we're about wrapping things up here. So this is actually at the Trinity Church in Stratford upon Avon. And these are the last words that we know that Shakespeare wrote. And you can see it there. And some of the letters look a little differently, but it's basically, good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stores, and cursed he be that moves my bones. So a writer to the end. A lot of people make a big deal about him leaving his second best bed to his wife, but the best bed was always left for the guest, and the second best bed would have been a way to show a token of his love and affection for his wife. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of background on Shakespeare that you'll find useful and interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading a play with you. Thank you for listening. Bye now.